Hello and welcome to day 2 of Race Before Race. After yesterday's extraordinary opening panel, I'm so excited for our conversation this morning and for more wonderful Race Before Race events over the coming days. And I'd like to begin by thanking the hosts and organisers of this gathering of Race Before Race Politics again. Brandeis University, ACMRS and ASU, and I'd like to extend particular thanks to Dorothy Kim, Ayana Thompson, Leah Newsom, Joel Christensen, Danelle Padilla Peralta, and Sasha May Eccleston. My name's Urvashi Chakravarty, and I am an executive board member of Race Before Race. And I'd like to start by recognising that we're gathering virtually today from many different places, and we're situated in many different positionalities. I'm joining you today from Toronto, and I'm a settler of colour here. I respectfully acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also wish to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and I'm deeply grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and learn on this land. I'm utterly thrilled to be moderating today's panel on white heritage politics with 3 extraordinary speakers. In order of their talks today, our speakers are Shyama Rajendran, Lubaaba Al-Azami, and Lyra Monteiro. In the interest of time, I will not be introducing them formally, but you can read more about their exceptional work in the programme. In terms of the structure of this morning's conversation, each talk will follow immediately on from the one before, and after all 3 talks are complete, the Q&A will begin. Please use the Q&A box to ask questions, and on another note, closed captioning is available, so please use the button at the bottom of your screen to activate closed captioning. And finally, if you would like to tweet or live tweet, we encourage you to do so. Please use the hashtag RaceB4Race. And without further ado, I will now turn things over to our first speaker, Shyama Rajendran.
Okay, so thank you very much, Shyama. And I hope that, tech has been the issue that's plagued us throughout the pandemic and this new world in which we live with digital events now. So I hope things work out for you, Shyama, and here's hoping that my internet stays. So first of all, thank you very much to Dorothy for inviting me, and for Brandeis, ASU, and ACMRS, and Ayana and all the amazing people there for hosting this incredible event. So I'm going to be talking about, I'll just share my screen now, and all right, everyone can see that hopefully? Yeah, okay, fabulous. So I am going to be talking about a colourful figure from history, Sir Hans Sloane, and the archives that he brought into existence. So many of us are familiar many of us who are familiar with London will be familiar with the name Sloane, if not so much the man behind the name. Numerous London landmarks in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea bear his name, most famously Sloane Square, but also Sloane Street, Sloane Avenue, Hans Crescent, Hans Town, and Hans Place. So who was this man? Why is his name everywhere? And why is his bust or portrait featured at the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the British Library? So Hans Sloane was a physician by trade, but most famously he was a collector, and one of the most influential figures in early 18th century London. He amassed one of the great private collections of books, plants, animals, antiquities, coins, and other curiosities. His collection went on to become the founding core of the British Museum, and later the Natural History Museum and the British Library. Sloane was born in 1660 in County Down, Northern Ireland, the son of a tax collector. He went on to train as a physician in London and France. He enjoyed considerable rise in later life to become physician to royalty and nobility. He received a baronetcy in 1716, became president of the Royal College of Physicians in 1719, and he succeeded Sir Isaac Newton as president of the Royal Society in 1727. But it is in his travels in Jamaica that a major source of his fortunes should be traced. In 1687, he journeyed to Jamaica as physician to the Governor Christopher Monk, the second Duke of Albemarle. Jamaica's economy was driven by slave plantations worked by enslaved peoples trafficked primarily from West Africa. It would be here that Sloane began to profit and benefit from the trade in enslaved peoples. Monk, from whom the physician's salary arose, oversaw Jamaica's slave economy. Indeed, soon after Sloane's arrival, Monk purchased a group of 69 enslaved individuals. While in Jamaica, Sloane actively collected natural specimens, acquiring over 1,000 plant specimens, live animals, shells, and rocks. He also wrote notes on local plants, animals, and customs. Enslaved people played a key part in enabling Sloane's collecting. Their knowledge and skills were often fundamental to Sloane's discoveries, and they assisted him in acquiring some of his precious specimens. In Jamaica, Sloane also met fellow physician Fulk Rose and his wife Elizabeth Langley Rose. Fulk Rose was a leading plantation owner and one of Jamaica's principal buyers of enslaved people. He was one of only 6 colonists who regularly imported large numbers of trafficked people from the Royal African Company. Sloane returned to London in 1688, and in 1695, following Rose's death, Sloane married the latter's widow in London. By this, he gained access to Elizabeth Langley's substantial dowry born of slavery, including her 1/3 share of the income from her late husband's extensive estates. Sloane therefore became the direct beneficiary of revenue from plantations worked by enslaved people, a financial arrangement that lasted many years. He regularly received his share from these plantations via slave trading ships. It would be following the windfall of his wife's dowry that Sloane's collection truly began to expand. It went on to include over 71,000 items, including over 50,000 books, prints and manuscripts, 32,000 coins and medals, a 332-volume herbarium of dried plants, and 1,125 things related to customs of ancient times, as he called it. The collection was built not only from the proceeds of plantations worked by enslaved peoples, but also the infrastructure of slavery. Slave ships and those who worked on them often assisted in collecting and transporting materials for Sloane. British merchants were the most prosperous slave traders of the 18th century, and from finance to infrastructure, Sloane was deeply implicated in that economy in the creation of his collection. In addition to collecting natural specimens, written records reveal that Sloane described various aspects of enslaved Africans' lives and collected their cultural artifacts. Sloane compiled a journal of his travels in Jamaica, which was published as a 2-volume book, A Voyage to the Islands of Madeira, Barbados, Nevis, St. Christopher's, and Jamaica. Often referred to as his natural history, much of this work is an illustrated botanical inventory of Jamaica's plants. However, the book also includes Sloane's close observations of enslaved people and their experiences in Jamaica. His view of these communities is far from complimentary, remarking that in general they are a, quote, a very perverse generation of people, close quote. His indifferent narrative of truly devastating brutality upon enslaved peoples makes for very difficult reading, and it is this in particular that I'd like to draw attention to. I will not examine the section detailing Black trauma in the interest of respecting the humanity of the people behind the pages and their descendants, but I will consider the text preceding and following it. These are sufficient to give an idea of Sloane's view of the enslaved individuals he encountered. I've also redacted offensive terms as unnecessary to understanding the essential meaning conveyed. We can see in the first extract here, Sloane writes, many of the people being slaves and their posterity after them in Guinea, they are more easily treated by the English here than by their own country people, wherefore they would not often willingly change masters. We see in this narrative a textbook example of Orientalist discourse in which the colonial master is framed as civilized in contrast to the uncivilized subject. However, it would be immediately following this assertion that Sloane would delve into the truly shocking torture meted out to enslaved individuals, with particular attention to punishments for rebellion. By such juxtaposition, Sloane appears to be seeking to justify the brutality in a sense of whatever we do, they do worse and they prefer us. Striking to us is the text that immediately follows the material on punishment, which can be seen in the second extract pictured, where Sloane smoothly shifts to a description of horses. The horses here are very fine, small, and for the most part well-turned and swift. The dehumanization here is clear. To Sloane, enslaved individuals, like the horses that also work the plantations, are no different to cattle and should be treated as such. Sloane not only recorded observations on the treatment of enslaved peoples, but he also collected items related specifically to the slave economy and its violence, a reality which may have been unique to him as a collector. These included such things as whips, nooses, and clothing. Excuse me. More troublingly, Sloane also counted human remains of enslaved peoples in his collection on Humana, identifying them as of Black enslaved people. As a man who, in James Delbourgo's view, was driven by curiosity above all else in his drive to collect, Sloane's lack of regard for the very basic human dignity of the enslaved individuals whose lived realities he recorded and literal remains he collected is evident. It is important to note that the reality of Sloane's involvement in the slave trade and his detailed record of the brutalization of enslaved peoples is far from new knowledge. Sloane's description of the punishment meted out to enslaved peoples is routinely quoted as an authoritative early source on the harsh conditions of slavery. Vincent Brown references it in The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery. Sloane scholar and biographer James Delbourgo examines the passage in some detail in his essay, Slavery in the Cabinet of Curiosities, Hans Sloane's Atlantic World, and references several other scholars over the years who've also commented on it. Brown mentions the violent passage as an example of how, quote, the punishments for rebellion were meant to inspire in the enslaved spiritual terror by visiting extraordinary torments on their bodies before and after death, close quote. On the other hand, Delbourgo's reading seeks to find an anti-slavery interpretation to Sloane's voyeuristic detailing of Black trauma, while suggesting, quote, Sloane's interest in slavery was shaped by the politically ambiguous logic of curiosity itself, close quote. How one identifies political ambiguity in an elite white man, a beneficiary of the slave economy, collecting, curating, consuming, and enabling the consumption for white audiences of the traumatic lived experiences of enslaved Black people is something to pressure more than a little. But this discourse is an example of the manner in which Sloane's at best complicity in the trade in enslaved peoples has been smudged to enable his continuing veneration. Upon his death in 1753, Sloane bequeathed his collection to the state for the sum of £20,000 payable to his heirs. The funds were raised by a public lottery and the collection was purchased by an act of parliament. The collection was then used to found the British Museum in 1759. In 1881, it was the founding core of the Natural History Museum, and in 1973, his books, prints, and manuscripts were the founding collection of the British Library. True to their value as the founding collection of three of Britain's most famous public research institutions, Sloane's materials enjoy research and generous investment to this day in Britain and beyond. The Reconstructing Sloane project, initially conceived of in 2010, brought together the British Museum, British Library, and Natural History Museum to work towards digitizing and cataloguing Sloane's vast yet dispersed collection. A Heritage Lottery Fund enabled the digitization of his herbarium at the Natural History Museum. Funding from the Wellcome Trust enabled the creation of the Sloane Printed Books Catalogue, a specialist database of Sloane's printed materials at the British Library. This is a project that I too worked on. The UK Arts and Humanities Research Council has funded research into Sloane's collections, including several scholarships for collaborative doctoral research. Little, if any, of this research and investment, however, has centered the more unsavory realities of the blood-stained finances and networks that brought these collections into being. The three institutions celebrate the collector as founder, with dedicated collections and web pages, as well as prominently located busts and portraits. In 2015, Sloane was chosen to be the first natural history hero, featured as part of a series by BBC Radio 4 in collaboration with the Natural History Museum. Some scholars and curators have sought to address the colonial violence in many a major Western public archive. In 2018, Senegalese scholar Felwine Sarr and French art historian Bénédicte Savoy published their groundbreaking report, The Restitution of African Cultural Heritage Towards a New Relational Ethics. In this report, they presented the case for decolonizing Western museums and highlighted the colonial systems of appropriation and alienation for which some European museums have become the public archives. It proposed the unconditional restitution of any object in national collections obtained through colonial era, quote, theft, looting, despoilment, trickery, and forced consent, close quote. Sarr and Savoy triggered a long smoldering global debate on the role of Western museums and the artifacts they hold. In 2020, Dan Hicks in the British Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution called for the return of looted objects as part of a wider project of addressing the outstanding debt of colonialism. Hicks observes how the British Museum began in the 1750s with a collection of Hans Sloane made during his life with an immense wealth derived from Jamaican sugar plantations. close quote. Furthermore, in response to the British Museum director's claim that holding often violently acquired materials is part of its role as a universal museum that, quote, holds for the benefit of humanity a collection representative of world culture, Hicks remarks that Sloane's collection is, in fact, quote, bric-a-brac of the New World plantocracy, rather than anything like the modern universal vision of global heritage. It is an exercise in sheer mythography and spin to claim otherwise, close quote. That the founding collections of some of Britain's most valued public institutions of learning and research were bequeathed by an individual invested in the violence of slavery is undoubtedly troubling. That this reality has gone largely unaddressed and the individual in question has enjoyed reverential treatment for so long is no less so. It's only recently that the pedestal upon which Sloane has long perched is beginning to be questioned. This is particularly following the murder of George Floyd, when these discussions were forced to the table. The British Museum, not without little backlash from some quarters, has since removed Sloane's bust from its prominent position and placed it in a secure cabinet with other artifacts explaining his work in the context of empire. The British Library has retained the bust of Sloane in its main entrance, but placed an interpretative panel to contextualize him. The Natural History Museum published an article on its website discussing the indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans behind the success of Sloane, Darwin, and others. These are valuable, if early, steps. Yet it is not only the institutions that bear a responsibility to face up to the legacies of colonial violence. I draw on the example of Sloane as a founder of some of our most valued archival institutions that we as researchers benefit from significantly in our work. The British Library in particular has been my most valued scholarly home for over a decade. That its founding archive is so entangled in the violence of the trade in enslaved peoples brings into question our own role and potential complicity in that violence as researchers of these troubled archives. As we critically examine the historical materials these institutions hold, are we doing enough to critically examine the provenance of these materials, the violence they are born of, and our role in that legacy? I would therefore like us to give thought to what it means not only to curate archives of violence, but also what it means to research archives of violence. Most crucially, what form would a decolonial disruption to archival violence take for us as researchers? Sloane's case also brings into relief the other forms of racial and imperial violence that are endemic in the archives we work on. From my own work as a researcher in early modern English transcultural encounters with Mughal India, I have often referred to Mughal manuscripts and miniatures. Among the most prominent materials I have turned to are the earliest surviving manuscripts of the memoirs of the Mughal founding emperor, Zahir ad-Din Muhammad Babur, and his daughter Gulbudan Banu Begum. In both cases, only one early, albeit not contemporary, manuscript survives. Given their obvious value to Indian national heritage and history, I initially sought these manuscripts in the libraries of India, assuming that that would be their natural home. However, I ended up tracing both manuscripts back to the British Library. How do such national treasures end up thousands of miles away from their home country to be in London in Britain's National Library? Given Britain's colonial legacy in India, the implications for the provenance of these materials are potentially concerning. In the case of the Begum's memoirs, the previous owner was Colonel George William Hamilton, who served in India from 1823 to 1867. The manuscript was then purchased by the British Museum in April 1868 from Hamilton's widow. As a decolonial and intersectional scholar and activist, how then does my work in these materials figure in relation to their problematic colonial heritage and legacy? These are questions crucial to acknowledge and address. This brings us to the question of where this leaves us as researchers, particularly as scholars who are conscious of and seeking to challenge racial and colonial violence. The violence endemic in the archives in which we work is in some ways the elephant in the room, and one we must finally take notice of. For myself, my work is centered on presenting a decolonial consideration of early Anglo-Indian encounters. I'd therefore like to consider one possible example of how a decolonial approach to archival violence might look. The problem of imperial and racial violence in archives poses what I believe are ethical questions with regards to our research. In many disciplines, such as the social sciences and in medical fields, ethical approval is necessary to proceed, particularly for research involving human participants or personal data. As an example, the University of Cambridge offers 5 key principles in their requirements for research and integrity and their application for ethical approval, which you can see on your screens. These principles center the rights of the human participants of the research. They are, number 1, respecting autonomy. Wherever possible, ethics committees will expect the researcher to demonstrate that they intend to respect the autonomy of individuals involved in their research. Number 2, maximizing benefit. Ethics committees will expect the researcher to show that their research is worthwhile and will have beneficial effects that outweigh the risks posed by the project. Number 3 is minimizing harm. Ethics committees will expect the researcher to have thoroughly considered the potential and potential severity for harm to come to research participants or others as part of their research. Number 4 is being fair. Research ethics committees will expect research to be, where possible, fair to those participating in research. And number 5 is behaving with integrity. Researchers have an obligation to conduct their research with integrity and transparency. Ethical approval is not a question that tends to appear in humanities research, and less so for pre-modern archival work. Yet, are we not working on personal data and human participants, even if no longer living? Do the rights of these participants not matter? Are the archives we work on not complicit in violence upon human lives and often implicated in a morally contentious provenance? We know that the violence of slavery far from ended with abolition. Neither did the violence of colonialism end with the departure of the colonizers. We know that those descended from these violences continue to bear the legacy in multiple forms, not least the injustice of their looted national treasures remaining in the archives of previous colonizers. And we know that racial violence in all its forms continues to rage to this day. Is not our engagement with archives that are born of racial and imperial violence then a matter of serious ethical and moral concern? Does our research in these archives match up to these 5 key principles outlined by Cambridge? 2 key points of thought then arise from this, and I'd like to close with these. Firstly, we should consider whether the humanities, in our case, those dealing in pre-modern literatures and cultures, should require a system of ethical approval. My tentative suggestion is yes, it should. There is real tangible violence in our archives and in archival work, and we can no longer overlook that. Acknowledgement is a crucial first step in a decolonial process of disruption. And truly decolonial and anti-racist work cannot ignore archival violence. The second point that follows is, what would a system of ethical approval in the humanities look like? This is a question that will require thought, collaboration, and discussion. And it's one that I would like to leave you with in the hope that this paper can trigger that essential discussion. Thank you.
Good morning or afternoon or evening or whatever it is, wherever you are right now. I really appreciate both the organizers of this conference and also everyone else who's come along to be part of it as well. This has already been a pretty special experience for me, I have to say, because I have not, generally been in these kinds of panels, in fact, ever, with alongside, people sharing this kind of identity. So my name is Lyra Monteiro, and I am going to be speaking a bit about a project that I have been working on and developing for about a decade now, and only really, since last summer, I guess, in many ways, really been able to catalyze into a place where it's actually coming to life. So, and I'm going to start off by, sorry, everyone can hear me, right? Okay, cool. Just give me a second to get my screen share set up. Okay, so having said all of that, I am about to make a really big assumption about everyone here. So fair warning. And I hope you will stay with me and see where I'm coming from with it. So what I'm going to state with fairly strong certainty is that we all know that the Greeks and Romans are white. To be clear, everyone watching this knows that the Greeks and Romans are white. And the breadth of that statement, as well as its verb tense, totally intentional. We all know this through a million tiny clues and a few more aggressively large declarations over the years. And I'm not talking about a scholarly understanding of the construction of race and its applicability to the ancient Mediterranean. Nor am I talking about a scholarly awareness that, statues such as the one that this cast is based on were originally painted in many different colors and were not, these pure white marble statues. What I am talking about is your immediate ability to identify this poster as white supremacist propaganda. I'm talking about the absolute absence of really any doubt in your mind, or perhaps more accurately, your body, as you may have been able to perceive just now when you saw it, as to who the our and the us in this particular image, in this particular poster, are referring to. Even before you process the green writing underneath, even before you've noted the reference to the Latin alphabet in that cute little substitution of the letter V for our letter U, you know that, right? And yet, much like a dog whistle, this poster doesn't say, hey, white people's world belongs to white people, or the world belongs to white people, right? It doesn't need to. And its message is still crystal clear to those who sympathize with it. But unlike a dog whistle, their message is also crystal clear to those who do not sympathize with it, namely really anyone who is raised with or lives within the context of the United States, within the context of Europe, or within the context of many of the societies formerly colonized by Europeans. You know a lot about whiteness and the ancient Greeks and Romans, even if you don't really especially know who the ancient Greeks and Romans were. I know not everyone here is a classicist, right? But you still know a lot about them and about the fact that they are white. So if you were to pass a poster like this at the University of Montana campus in August of 2016, you wouldn't have been at all confused as to who the us that this poster urged to become great again was. And not only because of the resonance with the slogan of then candidate Trump. Nor would you have had any question about who your is speaking to and being addressed by this poster if you encountered it at the University of Chicago in February of 2017. You know without any hesitation that these are hate speech and that they are about white power. And some of you may have already spotted that the images featured here are actually not classical images in the sense that they're not created by the Greeks or by the Romans, but rather created in the style of classical art, and represent the kind of start of this moment of European claiming of the traditions of those ancient civilizations more than 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. So Michelangelo's portrayal of the biblical hero David, and a late 17th century French statue of Julius Caesar. And it both matters and doesn't matter that these aren't Greek and Roman statues. They still mean that the Greeks and Romans are white. And that concept is still what they are drawing on. Their impact and their effectiveness with which they convey that message is the same. I'm speaking to you today from the Taino island of Boriken, a place that was colonized by the Spanish sometime between the creation of these two classical sculptures. More recently, the Boricua people have been colonized by the United States, for which reason I'm able to spend time here during the pandemic with relative ease. Colonialism is messy. And it's also a central force in shaping my experiences on this planet. And I know I'm not alone in that. I think about what it means to be on an island that can hold space for dozens of massive commemorations of their discoverer, Cristobal Colón, but which also remembers its original name after more than 500 years of resisting. And as I consider this, I also think of my maternal grandmother, Helen, who grew up in New England, unaware that many of her ancestors arrived on the Mayflower. And as was mentioned yesterday, right, that was almost exactly 400 years ago. And they were the first to colonize that and steal that native land. The supposed landing point, Plymouth Rock, would be marked centuries later by this temple, this classical shrine, built to enfold the white American heritage within that of Greco-Roman antiquity. And yet, here too, the Wampanoags know their name, even after 400 years of resisting. I marvel at this in part because I do not know the name of my land. My Portuguese last name is courtesy of the Portuguese invasion of the west coast of the Indian subcontinent. My grandmother's father even dropped his Portuguese family name, not quite sure what it is, honestly, when he moved from Goa to Bombay, in the British-controlled region of India. And as his last name, he took his middle name instead, Vincent, so that it would sound more like he was English. And so he would have better opportunities, job opportunities. And it worked. I also marvel at how all of these monuments to empire are also about whiteness and Europe. And also attest to the fact that the Greeks and Romans are white. Absent from this, situating of myself and my identity is another element of this colonial story, in that my maternal grandfather is a question mark, one that bears hints of links to Chinese populations imported for labor to the west coast of the United States and of Japanese internment camps. But my grandmother has passed and we will probably never know. So I have to admit that I had some hesitation about joining this particular conference. I'm in a lot of spaces on Twitter, and Classics Twitter is not one of them. And as I told Dorothy early on, I'm not invested in the project of classics. I almost drowned in the white intellectual arrogance that defines the field. And proving myself and my work and my concerns matter really ate up so much of my early adulthood. And I know I'm not alone in that experience here, especially after Dr. Haley addressed it so powerfully in the very first talk yesterday. And knowing that helps me feel more like I belong in this conversation. It does not, however, help me see what classics is if it is not a white supremacist project. The guardians of that discipline, specifically of classical archaeology, have repeatedly sought to silence me and to keep my work from being heard. And I fought back for many years, even as I began to slowly leave the field. As I got some distance in returning to coursework, partway through my graduate program, partly through working on my PhD, in an equally white public humanities program, I was struck by this really strong, intense awareness of how ancient Greece and Rome were quite clearly evoked and invoked, rather, in the context of the United States as precisely the kind of national origin story that I'd explored in colonial contexts in the ancient Mediterranean. And after studying this alongside learning about slavery in the Americas and settler colonialism in the Americas, it was equally evident to me that this was a specifically racialized origin story, a specifically racialized story of belonging. So this was a thing I knew. And sometimes we know things we aren't aware that we know, like some of you perhaps might not have known that you knew that the Greeks and Romans are white until I showed you those posters and you knew immediately what they were referring to. But the other times we know things and we know that we know them. And I knew that Greece and Rome were used as the glorious racial past of the Enlightenment present of a new United States, one that self-evidently justified the enslavement, removal, and exclusion from citizenship of people who were not white, and thus not heirs to that legacy. I knew that this was the case before starting work on my dissertation, and yet, even though I could see it so clearly, I knew that these white guardians of the many fields that this awareness addressed would not accept it without proper research. And watching a talk by Chris Roberts recently, I was really struck by, he was speaking in the context of a dispute, frankly, between white people in Providence and Black people in Providence over whether or not a particular building, the Market House, which is now part of the Rhode Island School of Design, is actually held enslaved people in the basement. And one of the things that that he said in response to that and regarding that is, you know, like his role was kind of being seen by a lot of people as, okay, you're going to go in the archives and you're going to find that evidence, right? And he had a really strong awareness of the fact that, well, the archive only holds the evidence that is chosen to put there, right? But also he pointed out, or asked the question really, of what does it mean to go into the archive for evidence of something that we already know to be true? And why do we deny, right, the relevance and the importance of ways of knowing that are not the ones that the Western Academy values? Well, for me, going into the archives to look for evidence of something I already knew to be true, that meant 4 more years of my life, compiling from a record from multiple archives to produce a dissertation on how both white and Black Americans used Mediterranean pasts to make racialized claims about their rights to citizenship during the period between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And, you know, a lot of the times this was very challenging because, as even we saw with the Identity Europa posters, you know, oftentimes even like really straightforwardly not ashamed at all, you know, white supremacists like Thomas Jefferson, for example, they weren't going to come out and say explicitly, my love of classical architecture and why I think it needs to represent this nation is because it's by white people and white people are the best, right? In part, not because he was ashamed, I don't think, but because he didn't need to, right? Because they also all knew that the Greeks and Romans were white. But because of this, this meant that my methodologies were really very complex and super interdisciplinary. And as I looked and ended up really feeling like the best way of expressing this and articulating it was going to be through looking at how both ancient and modern bodies and spaces that were somehow connected to the ancient Mediterranean became part of these nation or rather national identity claims. I finished in 2012, and then I did a whole lot of not publishing anything from my dissertation. For more than 8 years, in fact, and not for lack of trying. I was just worn down by all of the objections and rejections of the work. All of this stuff, again, that Dr. Haley talked about yesterday morning. And then I stopped for a while completely. And, you know, again, recently have realized that actually the real problem is that that was not my audience. The political move that I am most committed to making now is one that shifts the focus of my care, attention, labor, and thought away from trying to justify or prove or explain to white people that classics and the concept of the classical exist to oppress people of color. Honestly, I don't have a lot of faith in white people's ability to deal with their shit, even once they're aware that it's shit, you know, which most of the time they aren't anyway. So trying to convince them that it's there just didn't seem like the most valuable path to consider to continue to pursue really on any level. And just because I know that, you know, the conversation yesterday resonated so much with so many people, I need to share one of my favorite articulations of what I mean by this, right? You know, like, so this is also going back to Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's Undercommons book, which was also referenced yesterday. I'll read from this a little bit. Fred is talking about how the ones who happily claim and embrace their own sense of themselves as privileged ain't my primary concern. I don't worry about them first, but I would love it if they got to the point where they had the capacity to worry about themselves, because then maybe we could talk. That's like that Fred Hampton shit. He'd be like, white power to white people, black power to black people. What I think he meant is, look, the problematic of coalition is that coalition isn't something that emerges so that you can come help me. A maneuver that always gets traced back to your own interests. The white saviorism that, again, came up yesterday. The coalition emerges out of your recognition that it's fucked up for you in the same way that we've already recognized that it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too, however much more softly, you stupid motherfucker, you know. So yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at, right? Not interested in trying to convince white people that I have something important that they need to learn. But I do continue to believe that, you know, the work that I was doing in my dissertation is actually really important and essential and addressing things that aren't really out there otherwise, right? And at the same time, you know, through teaching in a history department at Rutgers Newark, among other departments, but primarily that's where my appointment is, where the vast majority of the students are people of color, and many are also first generation college students, and many are also first or second generation immigrants. I have become acutely aware of the complexities of sharing with young people of color narratives of the past that explain with a kind of inevitability how the world we live in is constructed around their oppression. And given that my dissertation work was focused on the US between gaining independence from England and the ending of slavery, it's far from straightforward to think about how I can pivot really from offering up that work to try to persuade a white audience of yet another angle on white supremacy, and instead pivot towards seeing how that work can be in any way, you know, not also additionally traumatizing to people of color. Right? Here's another way in which we're screwed, right? Here's another way in which we don't belong. And yeah, and honestly, like one of the areas that I've turned to, you know, fairly quickly after teaching and noticing the impact of the traditional narratives on my students, was that I really got a sense of like, no, this is not okay, right? What we're doing in the classroom is actually traumatizing students, on top of ancestral trauma, right? From that same history that has been experienced. And I don't want to be a part of that, right? Realizing also that the way history is written traumatizes those who are not white and not male by design, which is another one of those things where as soon as you think about it, it's just like, well, yeah, that makes sense, right? And, you know, I have no doubt that that's one of the reasons why students of color don't really tend to flock to, you know, classics majors and history majors and, you know, to studying the areas that the folks gathered at this conference do study. And while I believe that knowledge can be liberatory, it can also be oppressive and traumatizing. And to say that the historical knowledge regime in which we all labor is Eurocentric and patriarchal is not to describe a situation that's in need of a mere course correction. It's become increasingly clear to me that in order to address the silences, right, referencing, Michelle Rolfs-Trujillo's book and amazing work on silencing the past, right? It's never going to be a matter of just filling in the gaps, multiculturalism style. Oh, you can have a bit of history. You can have a bit of history. Let's have a few stories about women thrown in there. I think there might be a queer character here. Awesome, right? That's not actually going to get us anywhere. So for several years, I've really been steadily moving away even from a focus on content towards a focus on developing trauma-informed pedagogy to teach pasts that are oppressive to my students. And I've experimented with a number of different approaches, trying to take care not to inflict further harm upon them, like, again, this historical trauma, without first giving them the scaffolding and the tools with which to deconstruct the damage history is designed to do to them. And this work has inevitably brought me to the question of, like, why work so hard in order to teach oppressive past to my students to begin with? And this question has led me to a place where trauma-informed pedagogy has kind of given way to what I'm now seeing as a more actively anti-oppressive pedagogy. So I'm not just trying to be a buffer, I'm trying to be like, actually, no, we're going to war, right? I never use war metaphors. I'm amazed I said that just then. But I guess that's where I'm at with this. And partly why I'm excited about this is because I'm just wrapping up a semester in which I have been applying a new approach. And that is also one that I've been working on for a while, as I said, that I'm calling liberation archaeology. And if I had to try and describe it really kind of quickly, it's partly like a history of the present, partly a Michael Shank's, 10 things course, I believe it was 10, the Stanford model that he has for, like, one thing a week that you just take all the way back and figure out where it came from, whether it's like a car or whatever, where the technologies come from. The difference here is that is the foregrounding of oppression and understanding mechanisms of oppression in shaping aspects of our worlds, as well as in perpetuating oppression, right? Of empire and of nested experiences and expressions of empire over time, whether in the same places or carried from one place to another. And in placing certain bodies in certain places and racing them in certain ways and understanding how all of those things really function. Metaphors of excavation work really powerfully here, as do concepts like stratigraphy, especially when digging through those multiple layers of empire. And so the course that I've been teaching this in this semester, it's a writing intensive course cross-listed between history and African-American and African studies. In some ways that means nothing though, because at Rutgers Newark, pretty much students can take courses wherever they want and they can get a credit for a writing intensive course, even if they're not a major in those fields. Although I did have some AFAM majors in this course. And apologies. All right, yeah. So we're still in Zoom school at Rutgers. So that's definitely not the ideal format for a course that's kind of grounded in, the ground and like spaces, things, landscapes, etc. But we've been making it work. And part of the way that we've been really approaching that is, that while there is a significant research component to the course, it also draws and relies heavily on what students already know, even when they don't know that they know that thing, right? So we've looked at many different sites for our excavations over the course of the semester, but I'd like to focus here on just sharing an example of one site that we were looking at with a lot of intensity and repeatedly across the course of the semester as kind of a model for how we could study other things. And that is the column. So in late February, nearly 2 months following the attack on the Capitol building, I invited students to look closely at the Capitol building and think about what it represented, right? And the initial kinds of lists and responses that came out of that were things like democracy, stability, the nation, these kinds of things, patriotism, government, etc. And then the next prompt was really kind of to look more closely and kind of think about the columns and think about where else they'd seen those columns, right? Where did they see white columns in their worlds? And at that point, you know, when they started thinking about buildings collectively, they got there pretty fast. We had power, we had order, we had white supremacy within, you know, no time at all being thrown into the conversation. And this was really the only thing that I asked them to do that would have involved being outside, right? But since nobody was vaccinated at that point, it was entirely optional as to whether or not they would, do this assignment by actually going out into the world. They could also do it on their phone using the mapping app and then Street View. But the assignment, which is kind of described here, invited them to identify one single architectural element from the Capitol building, right, on a building in their communities, which is columns. And anyone who's done, like, you know, classical art history, or probably any form of art history or architectural history, will probably find my description of what kind of columns to look for quite, you know, horrifyingly, you know, vague in general. And, you know, but I kind of think that, like, white columns are white columns, you know. I kind of think they all kind of do the same kind of work. And so that's really where we started. What they found in doing this was a lot of town halls, a lot of municipal buildings, courthouse, hall of records, right? And you can see here the mixture of people who had actually gone in person versus done it on their phones. Other students found some other kinds of buildings, like on the far left is an apartment building in one of the students' apartment complexes. And that student was able to notice that the buildings that looked like this, that had these, well, technically pillars, right, on them, were fancier, right, and like cost more money to live in than the ones that were in the same apartment complex and did not have those. And a symphony hall, a church, of course, very commonplace for those to show up in the US. Because, and this was a really valuable exercise also because, you know, when I asked, okay, where do you see them originally? They're like, oh, I see everywhere, they're everywhere, right? It's like, okay, are they on public housing? Okay, are they on sewage treatment plants? Like, where are they, you know? And they found it. They found out where they were. And then also a lot of schools. And most of these buildings, it should be said, are located in areas in New Jersey that are now predominantly non-white. New Jersey has a massive and super diverse immigrant population. But of course, that was not the case when these buildings were built. And I have to admit that even though I knew, you know, I knew that they would find these very easily and quickly in their communities, and I knew that there would be a lot of repetition. I did not know this was going to happen, though, right? This is out of, you know, it's a relatively small class. I think maybe there were like a dozen students who chose to do this assignment. And, you know, out of those students, like, these are all the same building, right? Pretty much. They aren't, I mean, in the sense that they're all like, they're from 6 different students in 6 different towns. And they represent municipal buildings and also schools. But that kind of structure of, you know, a city block long red brick building that's 2 to 3 stories and has steps leading up to, you know, 4 white columns with a white triangular pediment and a white clock tower on top of it, like that it was even surprising to me how much repetition there was around that particular form. Also, these are buildings that students had intimate relationships with. One student went to high school in one of these buildings. And now one of her siblings goes there, and she still sees it every time that she takes the other sibling, or rather maybe pre-pandemic, took the other sibling to elementary school right next door, or to play sports or anything like that, right? Another student lives behind her town hall, and she can see the back of it just by opening up her window. And the back does not look like the classical front, of course. Another student identified the 3 different buildings with columns that were all just down the street from her, less than half a mile away and within blocks of each other, that had columns: a church, a municipal building, a school. And then a number of other, or at least 2 other students selected buildings that they used to walk past when they were on their way to and from high school, right? While another student found the place that her high school graduation had been held. And one of my favorite little details in terms of like contextualizing them and what they meant in their lives was that a student who lived down the street from that extremely classical courthouse a few images back described it as being next to the deli. And by this point, of course, they'd started noticing and asking questions about, this oversimplification that I'd given them about what columns were, right? About these white columns. And so, we talked about like the existence of all of these different types of classical columns, but and styles and whatever, not with the intention that they memorize any of it, right? But just so that they have access to it. And then, but also so that they could think about, well, why would it matter to the architects of this or to the people who wanted this building built to have it within that precise style, right? And not any other style. And as the semester progressed, we returned to consider these buildings, and observations such as the connections between the architecture representing choices that have been made in the past when the building was built and that may no longer be well suited to people today, in the same way that systemic oppression is rooted in the past, was one of the really powerful observations I saw from a student. Several also made connections to slave plantation mansions through, this and through our study. One student registered that Thomas Jefferson's white columned home was on the nickel, and that was not, in fact, the White House as they imagined, but also that it was really disturbing that the White House looks like a slave plantation. Students also started to consider and articulate really clearly who these buildings were for, and who these buildings made comfortable as opposed to who they made uncomfortable, and how these buildings marked the kind of wealthy white male territory of those spaces historically, even if not in the last decade or 2. So moving out from this, some students started to investigate the people that these schools were named after, or the plazas in the city hall that City Hall sat on. And almost invariably, these were men directly responsible for the territorial expansion of the United States. So American empire, right? Being symbolized by, material that represents an empire that never was in the Americas, right? In terms of Roman architecture. And I should say that also if you include Columbus in that category, which for some reason he does get included in that category by Americans from basically the beginning, for whatever reason. And they also then applied these approaches to make sense of how power and empire operate in and through language and language hierarchies. I had no idea there was going to be a discussion of language hierarchies already today, so that's awesome. And also through, Rutgers University and within their own families' histories of migration. And so, yeah, this is, and basically, this course and this methodology is frankly really awesome for me because I have all of this random knowledge that's kind of important, right? And my ability to read these aspects of landscapes and aspects of, colonial histories and that shape, again, the lives of my students among, a lot of other people as well. And to be able to work with students to kind of peel back these layers of power nested within power, and really consciously just deploying these symbols and see how these symbols are really consciously deployed as a tool of oppression can be really intense. But ultimately, unlike when I'm teaching kind of a set curriculum that's supposed to cover a certain kind of history that marches relentlessly to the present, their choices were their choices were really what drove what aspects of their worlds they were investigating, right? It was the things that they already knew kinda, and then really digging into them. Areas of tension, areas of confusion. And for me, this was really, again, an entirely different proposition than working with neatly packaged narratives from the past to the present, and then very different from what I've ever felt allowed, or rather a lot, that there's been made space for within traditional academic approaches. So that said, this is still very much an evolving project, and I'm looking forward to doing it in person, you know, and also to continuing to uncover ways that we already know objects, images, and spaces that to mean that the Greeks and Romans are white, by which really I only mean that, you know, the construct that we have in this country and in, you know, popularly understood, right? They are present tense. The Greeks and Romans are white. And yeah, and I ultimately hope to take this in other directions as well, right? I think it's best as a traveling program, actually, which is kind of crazy, but I hope to be able to do that someday. And yeah, I look forward to. So I'm going to stop talking now and look forward to the conversations that we are all going to have on this panel. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all, Lubaaba, Shyama, and Lyra, for 3 extraordinary papers. We'll now open up our Q&A. A quick reminder that you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will relay them to our extraordinary speakers. And one of the things that I found really astonishing about the ways in which these papers spoke to one another is how I think you're all thinking about, amongst many other things, the sort of fictions that structure our responses to both our built and our heard environments. And those responses are both sort of naturalized at this point, but you're also thinking about ways of attending to different kinds of audience. You're refusing a mode of audience making, and we heard a bit of this yesterday as well. You're refusing an audience that will reinscribe or reinforce or refuse to heed the kinds of narratives that structure the environments that we move through every day. And our first question, I think, also sort of thinks about ways forward, which I think all of you attended to in various capacities, which was extraordinary. And Dorothy Kim asked that all of these talks really grapple with some of the issues that were brought up in the first panel yesterday. We have no language, we don't have the correct language, we have no documents, etc. I'm wondering how the idea that Christina Sharp's book, In the Wake, discusses that undisciplining really is at the center of what all of you are discussing, running into walls, dealing with the suppression of our work. And Dorothy gives this quotation from Sharp. We must become undisciplined. The work we do requires new modes and methods of research and teaching, new ways of entering and leaving the archives of slavery, unquote. So I'd like to invite all of you for a few moments to sort of reflect on this matter of undisciplining and maybe to think with Dorothy's question, if you would.
I mean, I think that Dorothy sort of really picks up at the crux of the matter here, in my view, in terms of even what I'm talking about is archival work and how we approach it. And the discipline of that entire discipline is also, constructed around whiteness and white supremacy. So, you kind of have to break free of certain kinds of the discipline, so to speak, to think in terms of how is this oppressive and how is this harmful and how is this perpetuating certain violent structures. I mean, and one of the things in terms of undisciplining, part of it is also like we have to undiscipline because the people who built up the disciplines came from white supremacist space. So also taking on that model, we need to have it's kind of, again, that whole more diversity in the boardroom, right? So, you know, I was speaking about museums and libraries, etc. You know, and if the leadership, like the leadership of these kind of institutions that's kind of govern what an archive is reflective of the world they say they universally curate, then these discussions and these structures and these new defining parameters can be brought together in a very in the collaborative way it needs to be done, right? So, for example, for me, you know, in my work, when I'm looking at a Mughal manuscript, for example, you know, if a white person looks at a Mughal manuscript, they'll be like, "Oh, this is nice. I'm thank God the British Library's got it. You know, they're keeping it safe." Well, hey, my grandparents were colonized by the British, right? We are raised in this discourse of stuff is stolen, right? One of my earliest memories is my cousins telling me about how, you know, the Queen's jewels are ours, like she stole them. So we come with this consciousness. So, you know, if you need those kind of voices in the room to be able to construct these discussions. You know, for someone like me of South Asian heritage, or, you know, people who are descended of colonial violence, this is just bread and butter to us. But, you know, if you're not in the room, you can't bring the bread and butter. And so then when you tell a white person that, you know, this, you know, how the hell did this get here, right? They'll be like, "Oh, I never thought of that." You know, for them it's a revelation. So I really think that, you know, Dorothy's getting to the crux of the matter, that this is about undisciplining, and not only undisciplining but redisciplining, right? And that is a collaborative, inclusive process for it to be meaningful.
If I can just respond to the question, can everybody hear me okay? Is this fine? Okay. Yeah, so, you know, at least with the work that I've been doing with looking at these writings from 19th century philology, as Hal Moma outlines in her book, from 19th century philology to English studies, right? English departments became what they are out of philology, right? So at some point in the early 20th century, philology, this sort of philology split into linguistics and literature. So hang on. Sorry, is it working now? Okay. So they split into philology and English literature, right? Or linguistics and English literature. Now, you know, in terms of thinking about my own relationships to the English language and going directly to Dorothy's language of no papers, right? So I was born in India, and I hold an Indian passport, but I was raised in the Philippines, and I went to an international school, and went to college and grad school in the US. Because of the passport I had to take the Sorry. I had to take the test of English as a foreign language twice. Coming out of school in the Philippines, and then you know, going to grad school as well. Sorry, this is, I don't know what's wrong with my speaker, but yeah, I took the test of English and language just because of the passport I held, and despite the fact that my entire educational history had been English. You know, so talking about discipline, and this is also about the way that borders are controlled, and okay.
So I think whilst Shyama reconnects, we might move to our next questions, if that's all right. And again, you can put your questions in the Q&A box and I will relay these wonderful queries to our panelists. And thank you so much for your generous answers to that question of undisciplining. The first question is from Catherine Stutz, and it's a question for Lubaaba. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm curious about your proposal for an ethical approval process for archival research. How do you imagine this would be implemented, and who might determine what kinds of work could be considered ethical, and what could be done to reckon with the fact that one of the central concerns of ethical social science, which is consent, is complicated for archival research by the temporal distance from our research subjects?
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that question. It's a wide-ranging question with wide-ranging answers, and part of the reason I sort of ended the paper with this call for discussion is because it's not an answer that I have a right to make on my own. I believe that, you know, this is something that needs to be done in discussion and collaboration. A few points that I will make, though, is Sarah and Savoy in their report calls for collaboration. So in their report, they call for collaboration with African nations with regards to this discourse on repatriation of colonially looted objects. And I think that sort of gets to the crux of the matter in certain ways, that when it comes to materials which don't belong to the archives in which we research, so when it comes to Mughal manuscripts that are in the British Library when they should be somewhere in India, you know, so that's something that, you know, you have to involve India in that discussion, right? Maybe the current government might not be so keen, seeing as they got issues themselves, but so in that sense, a discussion for a way forward has to be a collaborative one that involves the various actors who have a right or claim to these archives. That's one thing I'd say. The other is, you know, we're very and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm always happy to learn, but we're very early on when it comes to this acknowledgement of archival violence. So, you know, just like Urvashi sort of began her presentation by acknowledging the land on which she is, I think that is an important first step of acknowledging the violence in which we work, right? So in that sense, acknowledgement is a key thing. In terms of consent, again, I hark to collaboration on that point, that, yeah, consent, these are people who may be long past, or owners who may be long past, but I think that, you know, we should be calling on the descendants, right? So when it comes to like, again, I'm going to refer to the work that I do, which is Indian manuscripts. So when it comes to that, you refer to India, you know, and just because Babur died all those years ago doesn't mean that, you know, this doesn't belong to his land. So in that sense, consent doesn't necessarily have to be from the people themselves. It can be from their descendants and from the people who have the claim to it now. Right. So I think consent is a less complicated matter in that sense. And I think this also brings us back to what Dorothy was saying in terms of undisciplining. You know, these are disciplines that are not determined by people who are emergent from colonial violence. You know, these are not the archive and provenance and book history and archival work. These are things that, you know, are not determined or decided on by, you know, people like us, so to speak, you know. So in that sense, you know, what is needed is for basically people like us to come together and have these collaborative discussions and define a fresh framework for how to do this. And I think that, you know, that'll be something that's necessary, and that's very important to do right now. You know, and because, I mean, I love the British Library, but Western heritage is all white. Right, there's really a shortage of diversity. The leadership really lacks diversity, not just the British Library, across all these institutions. And these are national taxpayer funded institutions. They should reflect the nation, right? The nation looks like me these days. So in that sense, you know, we need to have these collaborative discussions and have the key players involved. So as I say, it's, you know, it's a complicated discussion, and I hope that more of us get involved in it and start having this discussion. But I think a first step is acknowledgement, and acknowledging that I am working with material that's problematic, and the fact that my working with it is problematic without acknowledging it. and that there are rights that are being infringed on here.
Lyra, you're muted.
I was just asking if it's okay if I jump in on that question as well, because so it makes me think of so many things that, of course, I mean, like the echoes of this stuff happen no matter where you are on colonized land, right? And it makes me think about the immense amount of labor that these kinds of requests, repatriation, yay, aren't you happy, right? But hang on, right? Like, that it's the messes that empires make have then continue to, drain the resources and, the life of former colonial subjects who are, if they would like to, get their, whatever it is, family members remains or objects or archives back, right? Or land for that matter, right? It's a lot of work. And I don't care about like how much work it is on the part of the colonial power, right? But it's I think it's really important to also that be built into the process too, right? Somehow, I don't know if that's like, I don't know what that looks like, right? But for anything like that. And I also just wanted to say that I do really love this idea of an ethical approval process for archival research. I don't know if our generation is one in which it will happen, but considering, as you say, like who controls these disciplines and who controls these spaces. But one of the things that I like about it is probably one of the things that a lot of researchers are going to hate about it, which is that it'll slow things down. And I think that's okay, because I think that like it's really hard to do work on, people who aren't alive anymore without frankly engaging in colonial behavior towards those individuals, right? And towards their societies, towards their cultures, and projecting our desires onto them, taking the resources that we want from them and like moving on, right? And so I definitely don't have any problem with the idea of a process like, or rather not don't have any problem. I like the idea that would, could slow down the work, right?
I think the labor point is really important, and how we work around that, because the labor is real and it's exhausting, and we all know that, right? So that's and as you say, really it's they need to take on the labor. I guess so. Again, that would be a discussion of how that would look like, and in that sense. But this but in terms of as you say, slowing down the research process, I mean, I think research is meant to be reflective, right? We're meant to be reflective about what we do. And if we're just in a hurry to just get out the next big thing, then, are we being activists? Are we being anti-racists? Are we doing the work in that meaningful manner? And there's so many disciplines that have ethical approval processes. They're getting on with it, so why not us? We can do this. Right. And if it furthers our work as activist scholars and the work of anti-racism, then that's something that we should be doing and we should be leading on. And we should be swatting away the naysayers about.
Am I audible first?
Yes.
Okay, great. No, so just because in terms of what I was saying just before I disconnected and reconnected in from something else, fine time for my laptop speaker to start dying on me. But the thing I wanted to sort of say was that, even though like I hold a PhD in English literature, I am still subject to sort of the kinds of English as a foreign language tests, kind of requirement, for various application processes. I like, at least in terms of my personal history, it's also influenced how I think about my own relationship to the English language. So going back to, Dorothy's question about discipline and the fact that I was trained in, medieval lit as a PhD student, but now I also teach English lit in India, in English, to Indian students, right? And sort of in English language politics here are really complicated, right? I mean, so when you move outside of the United States, your proficiency in English is also often a measure of your class, right? And the education that you've been allowed to have access to. So what I didn't have time to say in my paper, because we were all given our 25 minutes, is basically that the project I'm working on is also kind of drawing from methodologies in ratiolinguistics. And within ratiolinguistics, the model is that there is it's not only about the raced body that is speaking, but that there is a white, listening subject who is racing the body as the body speaks, right? And basically what I want to expand that to, and what I've been trying to think about is, how do you expand that to the positionality of the white reading subject, right? Because say, I consider myself a native English speaker, right? But I am not seen as a native English speaker, right? So how are the ways in which we've also been trained to read part of the reason that we sort of unquestioningly sort of assume things about, say, language, right? Which is the point I was trying to make in the talk, is that perhaps what we do require methodologically is also a model of resistant reading, where we're recuperating some of this.
Thank you so much for those answers. And a couple of things that occurred to me as you were talking. Shyama, your work seemed to fit in really nicely with the work that's emerging on sort of sounding whiteness and sonic landscapes. I'm thinking of work by Kim Hall and Jennifer Stover and David Sterling Brown. And Lubaaba and Lyra, one of the things your answers makes me think of is the way in which the process of publishing, of doing research itself is not only extractive, but then reproduces that sort of extractive model through speed, through sort of going into the archive, taking something out. And so the kind of praxis of reflection is also a kind of larger structural resistance, as well as a more sort of reflective research praxis. Our next question is for the entire panel, and it comes from Ayana Thompson, who says, I love the idea that we have knowledge we already know to be true. And I wonder if all of you might frame that as knowledge that comes from other fields, such as critical race theory, African-American studies, feminist theories, post-colonial theory, and so on. In other words, we are even more rigorous.
So I have thoughts on that. And also, yeah, connecting also back to Dorothy's original question around undisciplining. I think that I don't think it's possible to do the work that, gosh, I really want to memorize this and be able to say it constantly, Lubaaba, because I think it's just so well put, that people who are descendants of colonial violence, was that the phrase that you used? Yeah, I don't think we can do the work that we need to do, right? That we need to have in the world, that we need to do for our own existence, right? I don't think we can do that within traditional disciplines, exclusively. I don't think, because that by definition, right? They were defined, these disciplines are defined to serve whiteness, and we are defined as not existing within that, right? So on the one hand, I think that absolutely what we're able to know must come from all of these other areas that we go to look and see, do you have something here that can help me make sense of this, that can help me do this work, right? And that is often regarded as not legit, right, by traditional disciplines, which is a real bummer when you're trying to get, a job or promotion or whatever else, right? But so absolutely, those are part of how we know things, I know that why I was able to know all the things that came together for me in figuring out my dissertation project. And it was just, it was because I'd spent a lot of time working on archaeological sites, classical archaeological sites, and it was because I'd spent a lot of time doing all of these different things. And yeah, and I also my degrees are all over the damn place, and I've been, taught within so many different departments. And and my work gets taught within so many different departments, you know, that like, I know that it's doing a thing, right? That I know that's valuable for me and that other people are finding valuable as well, but that can't happen within any kind of traditional disciplinary structure. And honestly, like I'd started calling myself an undisciplined scholar a very long time ago. So I'm you know, delighted that it's a more commonly discussed kind of phrase, because it was just so obvious to me that that's what I was, right? However, I'm not gonna go towards rigorous, you know? I'm not invested in being rigorous. I'm not invested in the concept of rigor. I find that to be, frankly, one of the more patriarchal concepts and, you know, capitalist-driven kinds of concepts in academia that I don't need, you know? Doing the work is doing the work, I feel like. I don't need to define it as rigorous. I understand that would probably make again, you know, my tenure case a little stronger if I did frame it in those terms, but that's not what I am here to do, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that a lot of academia, and I as Shyama will know, I did a degree in the US as well, so US academia even more so. But England's getting there, you know, pretty swiftly. That there is a lot of capitalist framing in knowledge acquisition, and it's really unsettling. It's very, very unsettling. So yeah, I do appreciate that. In terms of what Ayana is saying, in terms of Ayana's question, I think that, you know, the idea that we have knowledge we already know to be true. Yeah, this is something that you know, like, you know, as colonial descendants or African American descendants of enslaved peoples or those kind of things, we come with a certain lived knowledge, and we come with certain descendant knowledge. And like Lyra was saying, that, you know, we live in a society where we don't exist. So in that sense, our knowledge also it does not exist. But you know, in our undisciplining and redisciplining, it's making that knowledge not, it's asserting that. I'm not going to say making, because it's there already. It doesn't have to be, but asserting that knowledge. And, you know, these are, you know, this is knowledge that we bring. It's rich, it's valuable, and it needs to inform our disciplines. It needs to inform these disciplines, which are, you know, that inform everyone, that everyone's learning from, but that lived knowledge needs to come as well. Not everything is from textbooks that are written by white people. You know, some of it is lived knowledge, and some of it is oral history, some of it, you know, so these kind of, so the weight of these that we naturally bring from our heritage and from our lived experience and from our family histories and our oral histories, in some ways, I mean, to use Anna's face, in some ways it does make us more rigorous, because we bring a whole wealth of knowledge with us that someone without that heritage or that experience doesn't. And so, yeah, it makes, I think it adds a great deal of weight to the work that we do.
I mean, I know pedagogically for me that it also has had a lot of influence after coming back to India and teaching here. You know, in terms of thinking about this. And, you know, because I taught Chaucer in the Arabic and Persian traditions last trimester. So we're still in the middle of our final term here, where I'm not teaching right now, but I did teach that course last term. And one of the questions I asked myself when I was designing that syllabus is how do I give my students a sense of ownership over Chaucerian texts, right? You know, in terms of them being, you know, in India, being descendants of that same colonial violence, right? And really thinking about how do I frame this for them on the first day about what we're trying to do here. And what I told them was, I was like, listen, we know the story of how Chaucer was the father of English poetry, which was, you know, a moniker attributed to him by Dryden, and the story of the great English literary canon from Chaucer moving forward. But that story is boring. So how do we tell a different one, right? So, like, you know, really kind of trying to give them the sense of agency of figuring out the intersections and parallels, and like allowing them the space to ask the questions that they wanted about the intersections of these texts, right? In terms of making them feel like they had ownership over what we were reading.
Thank you all so much. I think we have time for one last question, which is from Henry Walker, who asks, most images of white supremacy are stolen. The Indian Koh-i-Noor jewels in the British Crown, Egyptian pillars in Greco-Roman temples and plantation homes. Is it possible to take them back and detoxify them?
I'm just going to say I want to hear what Lyra has to say.
The only thing I want to add is that I love that there's still an activist group that's active in India that occasionally tries to sue back for the return of the Koh-i-Noor diamond. that I like seeing it like
I just say one of the things that irritates me most is that they went and cut that diamond down, man. Why'd they do that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough question. And honestly, one of the things that makes me think about is another stolen image of white supremacy that I think of as being even perhaps more powerful, because it was originally a symbol of, well, you know, it was originally a symbol of another ancient empire's power, right? Namely the obelisks that, you know, Rome would cart off from Egypt and whatever, and then that becomes also, and then, you know, Napoleon will cart off, and that, you know, and so we end up with that as a memorial form that came to, you know, kind of its greatest popularity right around the time that, you know, a bunch of people who are fighting to preserve slavery are dying in the Civil War. And so a lot of our monuments to the Civil War, both in cemeteries and like to individual people, and also, you know, in the center, for example, Ashland, North Carolina, right? Not Ashland, Asheville, sorry, wrong coast. We have these obelisks, right, that are symbols of the Confederacy. And memorials to the Confederacy. And that particular one I find just like really quite remarkable in terms of like the number of different like theft moments that happens, right? Like, oh, that's your symbol of your power, I'm going to take it. Okay, fine, no, I'm going to take it from you, right? Like, and now it's so powerfully associated with that particular thing. And in the case of the one, for example, the monument in Asheville, there was a lot of debate about, like, why does this have to be a Confederate monument, right? Frankly, not that many people went back to Egypt, which is interesting to me. But you know, they were like, it's not like it's a statue of a dude, you know, like we can make it something else. It's our like our town symbol, you know, it's where we gather for protests. How do we have, like, what's wrong with it, right? Yeah. Remarkably, the city council did vote to destroy it in place, and not and instead of just removing it and putting it in storage, which has happened with every other monument that has been taken down. So we'll see if that actually happens. I mean, that vote was in March, so we'll see what actually happens with that. But yeah, sorry, that's not actually directly answering your question. Other than that, I guess their conclusion was, you know, in terms of an obelisk, right? That the answer was no. I think it's really hard to, like, what would even mean to take symbols back, right? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that the meaning of these things do change, and I think that it's really hard to, I mean, like, I don't know enough about the classic Adolf Hitler example, but, like, you know, the meanings of things change. Can you really take them back, right? And do you need to? Do we need to? I don't know the answer to that either.
Your answer, Lyra, makes me think of a lot about, like, language preservation projects and language heritage projects, right? Because in which, you know, so like the argument is often made in these sorts of enterprises about preserving a language or recovering a language, or, you know, widely disseminating
a language, but sometimes it borders on sort of a fetishization, which doesn't then match the current reality in which certain languages are dominant and these languages are dying out because these languages are dominant, related directly to a colonial history, right? So I always struggle with the question of what does it mean to recover a language or reclaim a language that is just, you know, I mean, it's dying out for a reason, right? I mean, so, you know, I just wanted to add that to that was a thought that your answer had prompted.
Sadly, that takes us to just about noon. So I'd like to thank all of our three speakers for such wonderfully rich and generous and generative papers and conversations. And I'd also like to thank all of our audience members, those of you who are joining us now and those of you who will join us in the future. And also to our interlocutors for asking such provocative and generous and thoughtful questions. And also, I'd like to extend my thanks to our entire Race4Race community, the importance of community and the work that we do together came up in all of these talks today, yesterday. So I'd like to extend thanks to everyone and also remind everyone that this afternoon there will be a coffee talk with Joel Christensen and Dorothy Kim, and then at 5 o'clock a keynote conversation with Ibrahim Kendi. The schedule will shift just slightly tomorrow and Friday. The coffee talks will take place in the morning and panels will begin at 3 p.m. Thank you all again so much, and we look forward to seeing everyone there.